Welcome to your Test 3 review. Remember, as always, the test will open on Monday and close on Friday around midnight. So you have the full week to take the test, and as always, it is 50 questions, multiple choice, and you have 2 hours to complete the test. So this is your third test. Hopefully you guys know that by now. But let's just go ahead and begin the Test 3 review real quick. Hopefully this will be a short lecture video. You guys can take the test and then be on your way, be done with this class, and good to go. So, we covered a lot of topics over this last unit. We talked about political parties and courts, as well as domestic policy and foreign policy. So we have a little bit to cover, but we should hopefully get through this pretty quickly. So, let's go ahead and begin. We began about a month ago with week 12. We began with political parties. And we talked about a lot of different things under the political party realm, and so I would expect quite a few questions pertaining to this topic on your test overall. We began with just the simple definition of a political party. Political party is, once again, organized groups that seek to gain office and exercise political power through legislation, executive action, and control of government agencies. So they're organized groups. They can be highly organized, they can be highly efficient, such as the Democratic or Republican Party, or they can be loosely organized groups, which are typically more of your third parties. But they're all political parties, and they all want to gain office, and they seek to gain power through gain office and exercise that political power. And they want to gain power in the legislative, the executive, as well as other government agencies. If you remember from the original lecture, remember that the founders did not want political parties. They were really worried that political parties were just going to dumb down the system and that it would make things much more inefficient. To be successful, though, parties must have funds and a broad network of supporters. In order to be successful, parties must increase their power, and they must be active in the politics. So it often goes against what the founders wanted, and it's often contradictory about what the founders wanted compared to where our political system ended up today. Now, we talked about different models and meanings of parties as well. There's two different models. There's the rational party model and the responsible party model. So let's go ahead and begin with that on this slide. The rational party model is one which sponsors candidates for political office, and they want control of the government. That they sponsor the candidates. They don't necessarily push around the candidates. They don't want to make the candidates adhere to their own platforms or anything. They just want to sponsor candidates that can win political office and serve the party in government. On the other hand, there's the responsible party model. And this is where each party has distinctive platforms from each other. This is the system that's much more used in Europe, particularly the United Kingdom. They have a responsible party model. And the responsible party model, they have these distinctive platforms, and then they carry out that platform when elected. In comparison, when the United States, when a particular party gets elected or controls Congress or controls the executive branch, they don't necessarily carry out the platform. They have a platform just kind of as a formality, but they don't actually carry out that platform. In a responsible party model, if you have a responsible party model, you know what the party stands for, and you know what's going to happen in office as soon as they do get elected. Now, with the responsible party model, you also need clear ideological and philosophical differences, so that way you can distinguish between the two parties, and then the voters will vote on the party platform itself, not on the candidates which the party sponsored, like in the rational party model, but rather voters are voting on the party platform, and then they expect that party to carry out that platform once they are elected. So there's the rational party model, the responsible party model. I can guarantee there will be a question about it on your test, so be sure to know the difference. If you have questions, send those my way. Now, flipping to the other thing that we talked about, which is the meanings or the different types or facets of each party. We have the party organization, the party and government, and then the party and the electorate. The party organization is just the national party or the state party organization. It's let's say the bureaucracy or kind of the cogs in the machine that keep it going, keep everything organized. On the other hand, you have the party and the government. And these are actually elected officials serving in the government. They're the Republicans and the Democrats, and you may even have a third party in there that actually is elected to office and serving in government. So that's the party in the government. And then finally, there's the party and the electorate, and that's all card-carrying members. That's you and me, people in the general public that identify as a Republican or identify as a Democrat, Libertarian, Green Party, what have you. That's the party and the electorate. Political parties are also very active in the electorate, and they rely on the electorate to not only get them elected, but to keep them accountable as well. So if you want to break this down another way, if you remember this little acronym PIG, PI, and PO, party in government, party in the electorate, party as an organization. Should be pretty easy to memorize. Pig, pie, and po. Party in the government is pig. The officials elected under one party banner. Pie is all the citizens that identify themselves to the political party. And then po would be the formal apparatus of the party, the actual organization of it. So pig, pie, and po. Remember that for your test and you should be good to go. What do parties do? We talked about this just very briefly. What are the functions of the party? Well, parties, they recruit and nominate candidates for office. They want to connect them with supporters. They want to make sure that those candidates can win. They want to recruit viable candidates that can win elections. Parties serve as mechanisms for organizing U.S. democracy. They are part of the democratic system. They are essentially what we vote for. We vote for the Republicans, we vote for the Democrats, and that keeps democracy alive because it gives us something to vote for. They facilitate governing across all three branches, no matter who controls which branch. Say the Republicans control the executive, Democrats control the Congress, or Democrats control the executive, Republicans control the Congress. They facilitate that governing. The parties talk to each other. They try to get things going in terms of government, and they really serve the U.S. government overall. Parties also educate and inform voters. The party label is often used as a cue, so we kind of know what to expect from Republicans when they're elected. We know what to expect from Democrats when they're elected as well. They educate and inform us about the issues. They debate the issues. They actually talk them out, and they ultimately decide on the issues in terms of the party and government. The party label is really a cue. We use it kind of as a shortcut or a heuristic to what to expect from the U.S. government. Also, parties get out the vote. Parties are very active in getting out the vote. They want to make sure that their supporters get to the polls. They'll run vans, they'll run shuttles, that sort of thing, to get out the vote and ultimately bring people to the polls. Also, you'll have things such as canvassing. They'll go door to door and talk about the issues and things like that. That is all in an effort to get out the vote, ultimately. And then finally, political parties integrate new groups. As new groups come into suffrage and things like that, one party or another will probably try to attract those new groups and get them educated about the system and get them educated about U.S. democracy in general. So these are all just general functions of what political parties do. They do all these things. They are very active in U.S. democracy. They're an essential part of the political system. And so your question on the test will probably be something like, which one of these is not a function of a political party? It's whichever one is not one of these that I just went through. Now, finally, we're going to go ahead and break this down just a little bit. Remember, with pig, pie, and po, we're going to break it down just a little bit more. First off, we're going to talk about the party as an organization, the PO, if you will. Party as an organization is just really simple. There's a national headquarters, there's a party leader. We talked about Reince Priebus is the party leader for the Republicans. Debbie Wasserman Schultz is the leader for the Democratic Party. They all have a party leader, and those party leaders are in charge of overseeing what goes on in the party, organizing conventions, organizing campaigns and finance, and also doing research and communication. Ultimately, all of this leads up to a national convention. The national convention happens every 4 years. I'll probably post a link to to another YouTube video that can maybe explain national conventions just a little bit more. But national conventions are ultimately just the ultimate party for each political party, if you will. Happens every 4 years. The things that they actually do formally is that they officially nominate the president and the vice president candidate for that year. They ratify the party platform, and they ratify changes in party rules. Now that's formally, and all of that takes about an hour tops. And so the rest of the time it's just media events, parties, and things like that to try to get out the Democratic name and to try to convince regular voters that are maybe watching on TV to vote for Democrat or Republican, what have you. So that's just the National Convention, and the party as an organization is responsible for that. Now, on the other hand, there's the party and government. And these are just, once again, the elected officials under one party banner. We talked about the difference between a unified and a divided government, and I really do care that you know that for your test. A unified government is where one party has control of both the legislative and the executive branches. So you have a Democrat as the president, and you have a Democrat, and then you have a Democratic Congress. Or you have a Republican as president, and then you have the Republican Congress. That's a unified party in government, or a unified government overall. A divided government, which is much more common, if you remember the charts that I showed you during this lecture, it's much more common to have a divided government in U.S. politics. Divided government is where one party controls the legislative branch while another controls the executive. So you'll have Democrats, Republicans, or vice versa either way. you have a divided government. And this is much more common, particularly in midterm elections, if you remember. Midterm elections usually go to the party that is opposite of the president, and that's just how midterms typically work, and it ultimately results in a divided government. If you remember those one poll, I showed you that one poll from the lecture where people prefer a unified government because it's much more efficient, things get done, and things are much more in harmony. However, history shows that we are much more likely to get a divided government, which makes it frustrating and makes the political process just really slow and inefficient, ultimately. So that's quickly just the party and government, elected officials under one party banner. Please know the difference between unified and divided government. Now moving on to the party and the electorate. Party electorate, once again, is just the people that identify as identify with a particular party. So that's why I want you to know the definition of party identification, and it's the one that I really, really like. Party identification here is identified as a psychological orientation, a long-term propensity to think positively of and vote regularly for that particular party or for a particular political party. So I really like that definition because it is a psychological thing. Our party identification is embedded in our own brains, and as soon as we vote for one party, we kind of have this long-term propensity to continue to vote for that particular party because we think of them so positively. So once again, it's an individual voter's psychological ties to one party. I am a Republican. I am a Democrat. Whatever you say when somebody asks you what party you belong to, that's your party identification. Please do note that it's not the same as ideology, although we often do attach ideology to one party or another. Conservatives usually identify with Republicans. Liberals usually identify with Democrats. But it's not the same. You can have liberal Republicans, you can have conservative Democrats. A political party or a party identification is much more of kind of a psychological thing rather than a true personal belief sort of thing. So that's why I really like that definition of party identification, and I can guarantee that you will see that on your test. So all right. The history of the parties real quick, we kind of just briefly kind of went over this. The history of the parties, there has always been a divide between those who believe that the national government should have more power and those that believe in more in states' rights. And so I guess if you want to put this in modern day terms, those who believe that the national government should have more power nowadays are usually the liberals or the Democrats, and those that believe more in states' rights are usually the conservatives or the Republicans, or it's manifested in the Republican Party, I guess I should say, or manifested in the Democratic Party. And that's always kind of been the divide. Ever since the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, there's always just been this divide about whether the national government should have more power or whether the states should have more power and the federal government should ease off a little bit. So once again, originally Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, now Democrats versus Republicans, if you will. So that's just a brief history, easiest way to sum it up. There won't be a lot of history questions about political parties on your test, I can guarantee. So I just wanted to sum that up really quickly. Also with political parties, we talked about electoral laws. We talked about plurality systems versus proportional systems. And really, what does plurality mean? Well, the fact is that plurality really means whoever gets the most votes wins. As long as you have more votes than the other guy or than the other two candidates, what have you, that means that you win. Whoever gets the most votes wins. It's also called first past the post sometimes. Also in the U.S., we have this plurality system, but we also have single-member districts, which means only one person represents each district. Only one person represents Galveston's congressional district. Only one person represents Dallas's congressional district. Those sort of things. We only have one member who ultimately represents us or our respective districts. Now, I also mentioned Duverger's law, and I really do care that you know this because I can guarantee it will be on your test. Duverger's law is probably the closest thing that we have to a law in political science. And it basically looks at election systems, and it says that election systems that rely on single-member districts and plurality, which is the U.S., election systems that rely on single-member districts and plurality, like the United States, those sorts of voting systems favor a two-party system. So when people ask why we have a two-party system or why a third party will never be successful in the United States, it's the fact that we have these single-member districts and a plurality system. And if that doesn't quite make sense, maybe you can picture this graphically, if you will, and I showed this in the original lecture. The reason why we have a two-party system is because in a single-member plurality system, everyone is vying for this Joe Sixpack, or Joe Schmo, if you will, this average guy that represents the median voter. And in this sort of system, when everyone's competing over the median voter, The fact is that you have two parties. You have the Democrats and the Republicans, for the sake of staying here in the United States. And you may have a number of third parties also. They may be out here and they may be out here. The example that I have here is the Green Party, which is traditionally a left party. And the Green Party, it really wants to win elections. But the fact is that it's so far from the median voter that the median voter will actually be more attracted to the Democrats. So what the third parties will do is they'll attach themselves to the Democrats and say, hey, we have some voters out here in our own party. We swear allegiance to your party as long as you give us some concessions. Say maybe you give us some environmental protections or you promote climate change and those sorts of things. Then the third party will be absorbed up into one of the two mainstream parties, the Democrats or the Republicans. And so this is kind of why the Tea Party will never be standalone either. The Tea Party tends to be out here on the right, but they get absorbed by the Republicans because the Republicans are much more closer to this middle voter, which everyone is trying to attract. If you remember that little bell curve that I showed you once, the median voter rests right in the middle of that bell curve, and you have to win that middle chunk in order to win the overall election. And so that's why the single member plurality districts will result in a two-party system. And that's Duverger's law in a nutshell. If you need to look up other YouTube videos, I'm sure there's plenty of them, and they can explain Duverger's law just a little bit better. But if you have questions about Duverger's law and why that results in a two-party system, or if I didn't explain it well enough, please send those my way, and I can try to get those answered for the purpose of the test. But I just want to show that to you visually, just really quick. All right, and then finally we wrapped up week 12 by talking about third parties. And third parties, they don't do a whole lot, they don't win a lot of elections, but they do win some local and state elections. Third parties ultimately here in the United States, what they ultimately do is they force the majority parties to move either left or right to capture the lost votes, and they kind of play a big role in the platforms of the third parties in terms of concessions and trying to get the topics on the agenda and things like that. They get issues on the agenda through media coverage and public awareness, as well as just being politicians and dealing with the mainstream parties. So just wanted to wrap that up real quick. If you need to review third parties a little bit more, it's in the original lecture, and you can go back to that real quick. I wouldn't expect too many questions about third parties on your test overall. All right, so that was with political parties. Now let's move on to courts. We talked about courts just briefly. There wasn't a whole lot of material in terms of the courts lecture overall. The things that I do care that you know for your test, though, are certainly the different types of law. We talked about civil law and we talked about criminal law. And those are the two basic categories of law here in the United States. We have civil law, which is just, once again, just disputes among different individuals or groups or corporations in the government. This can deal with just simple things like divorce. It could also deal with contract law or even intellectual disputes or patent disputes, copyrights, those sorts of things. There's not really any crime necessarily involved, but there are damages. We talked about punitive damages and actual damages. The punishments ultimately don't result in jail time. It's more just about compensating the victims and things like that. So punishment usually just requires monetary or punitive payments. On the other side, we're much more familiar with criminal law. And criminal law defines crimes and provides punishments by charging someone with violating a particular statute. And that makes sense. We're very familiar with the concept of criminal law. The prosecutor is always the federal or the state government because you've committed crimes against a public statute, you've committed crimes against the government, ultimately. The punishment often involves fines and imprisonment, and then you'll have the guilt and innocent phase, and then you have the sentencing phase during the trial and things like that. So criminal law we're very, very familiar with. The thing that I'm going to put on your test is probably just the definitions of civil law and criminal law, and so be on the lookout for that, and be sure to identify which one is civil law, which one is criminal law. Moving on to the courts themselves, we talked about the constitutional courts, we talked about the Supreme Court. The thing that I care you know about the Supreme Court is that it was established in Article 3, Section 1, which states that the judicial power of the U.S. shall be invested in one Supreme Court, and such inferior courts as the Congress may ordain and establish. So Congress is ultimately responsible for establishing more courts. And we have the Supreme Courts, the overarching court at the federal level, but you also have the courts of appeals below them, which includes 11 districts, plus D.C., plus the federal circuit. So that's 13 courts overall, or 13 courts of appeals overall. So you have your 11 districts, plus you have a special court for D.C., and then you have a special court for the federal circuit overall. And then you have the district courts. You have 94 district courts. There's at least one per state, and no district is larger than one state. And I'm not sure why there's those extra T's on there. Please forgive me real quick. I'll go ahead and edit those before I post these slides online. But I'm not sure why I got carried away there with the T's. I'm not really unsure. Anyways, 94 district courts, 11 district courts of appeals, and then the ultimate Supreme Court. The Supreme Court consists of 9 judges. The number is established by Congress. We talked just very briefly about FDR and how he wanted to expand that number, but Congress would not allow him. So it's been stuck at 9 for quite a while. There is 1 Chief Justice plus 8 Associate Justices. The current Chief Justice is John Roberts. I can guarantee that'll probably be on your test, so hint, hint, probably star that or write it down real quick, that Chief Justice. The Chief Justice right now is John Roberts. The judges are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. They're usually chosen because of their legal and judicial experiences. They're very well educated. But that being said, each president does look at different factors, including their judicial perspective, how do they approach the bench, their temperament, and then also their ideology. The president generally wants a judge that generally agrees with their ideology and their plans for the future and how they may interpret the laws. So each president, the Supreme Court justices that they usually nominate usually reflect the president's ideology or political party of that time. And so you still have presidents on the court which reflect, say, George Bush, his ideology and his political agenda. You also have Clinton judges on there still that represent President Clinton and his views and what he thought of the time while he was president. And they're still serving on the Supreme Court today because they have lifelong terms, basically. So that's the Supreme Court broken down. But I also care that you know the different judges of the Supreme Court. If you remember the acronym RATS, Kansas KGB, you're good to go. We went through this in the original lecture itself, but remember that RATS, Kansas KGB breaks down in terms of conservative, moderates, and liberals. So the conservatives are the RATS. You have Roberts. I put a little star next to him because remember that he is the Chief Justice. You have Alito, Thomas, and Scalia. So RATS, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia. Those are the conservative judges. The moderates are the Kansas. They're Kennedy and Sotomayor. They're considered moderate. And then on the liberal side, you have KGB, which is Kagan, Ginsburg, and Breyer. And KGB is pretty easy to memorize because KGB was the former communist secret service. And so if you associate liberals with leftists, then KGB should be pretty easy to associate and get through for your test. RATS, Kansas, KGB, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, Kennedy, Sotomayor, Kagan, Ginsburg, Breyer. That's your 9 Supreme Court justices. So just be on the lookout for that on your test and be able to identify probably which one is not a Supreme Court justice, and that would be your correct answer there. All right. Finally, with courts, we also talked about original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means the first to hear the case. They decide the case first and set the standard for future courts that may pick up the case on appeals. Appellate jurisdiction means that they hear the case on appeals and they can overturn the decision of a previous court or uphold the decision of a previous court. I want you to please review when the Supreme Court has original and appellate jurisdiction, and be sure to distinguish when the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction or when it has appellate jurisdiction, and just be aware of that for your test real quick. So if you need to go back to the previous YouTube video and go over that real quick, or go over your slides, or send me a question about it, I will definitely be happy to answer those questions. Original and appellate jurisdiction, just please do know the difference. All right. We talked about which cases are heard before the Supreme Court. Well, the fact is that the docket is discretionary. The Supreme Court controls the number of cases it reviews. It receives roughly around 10,000 cases to be heard each year, but remember, it can choose which one it reviews, and so it usually only hears around 80 to 100 cases per year out of a possible 10,000. The case must be real, and there must be a controversy. It cannot just be a hypothetical question. It has to be actual real case, and the Supreme Court has to decide on it. The Supreme Court looks at a number of things. Remember that we looked at Q theory. Well, the fact is that most cases usually involve maybe a conflicting decision in lower courts. It often involves important questions of civil rights or liberties. And it's also, the Supreme Court has an interest in correcting wrong decisions from lower courts. So most cases reach the court through writ of certiorari, which, if you remember, is the right of a court to pick up an appeals case from a lower court. And Q theory says that justices look at cases and decide which cases to hear based on a number of key factors that may be present in the case. So the Supreme Court ultimately loves conflicts and it loves controversy. It loves deciding on those sorts of cases. It also loves deciding on real issues that may have an impact on the United States now. The Supreme Court loves to hear those sorts of cases, and that's ultimately what Q theory says, that justices will look at a number of key factors present in the case and ultimately select those cases based on if there's something conflicting or controversy, or they are interested in correcting a wrong decision, things like that. That's ultimately what Q theory states, and ultimately decides which cases are heard. So that's why the docket is discretionary. The justices will look at those sorts of things and decide which cases are heard. That's why only 80 out of 100, or only 80 to 100 out of a possible 10,000 actually get heard before the Supreme Court. We also talked about the Solicitor General. The Solicitor General has a huge impact on which cases are heard before the court as well. The Solicitor General is the attorney who argues all cases before the court where the U.S. is a party. So if the U.S. is a party, the Solicitor General is the attorney who argues on behalf of the United States. It's basically considered the 10th justice because he brings so many cases up. About 70% of the cases requested by the Solicitor General are actually accepted by the Supreme Court. The Solicitor General is kind of also sort of a screen. He screens out undeserving litigation and provides cases that deserve serious consideration. And the current Solicitor General is Donald Verrilli Jr., and he's very important into deciding which cases are heard as well. So you can see here about 70% of the cases that he brings up are actually accepted by the court because he screens those out, and he can screen out which ones have the real controversy or have the ones that absolutely need to be heard before the Supreme Court. And then finally, with Supreme Courts, we talked about the different types of court decisions. We talked about a per curiam decision, which the court renders a decision without an opinion, which almost never happens. What usually happens is that you're going to have a majority opinion, and then you're going to have a dissenting opinion. So a majority opinion is the one that decides the winners. They write how the court reaches its decision ultimately. The concurring opinion is where you may agree with the winners, but on a different basis or on different grounds. And then the dissenting opinion is the one that sides with the losers of the case. They still write an opinion, though, to maybe guide future courts that may look to overturn the case, or if another case with similar sort of background kind of comes up. Justices may look back at the dissenting opinions and say, well, you know what, that dissenting opinion, back then it may have been wrong, but now it actually applies to the case beforehand. And so if the precedent is ever overturned, the dissenting opinion has a lot to say, or has a lot of say in that ultimate decision. So dissenting opinion may side with the losers of the case now, but may be important in the future. And then finally, a plurality decision. We kind of went over those real quick. Those are very rare. It's just where maybe you have a 4-3-2 decision or something like that, where the plurality wins just simply because it got the most votes. But usually you have just the majority opinion and the dissenting opinion. Every now and then you may have a concurring opinion or a plurality. But once again, those are very rare. So please know the difference between majority opinion and dissenting opinion, and you should be good to go for your test. All right, so that was enough about courts. Finally, moving on to the latter half of this unit, we talk about the domestic policy and the foreign policy. Domestic policy and foreign policy, they all fall under the realm of public policy. And the definition that I really care of public policy that you know for your test is simply that public policy is a conflict over the ends of government. Public policy is whatever the government chooses to do or not do, ultimately. You have debates over the procedure and the rules are really just debates over policy. The results of public policy mirror the conflict and demands, the inputs and the outputs of government, ultimately. This is because of varying consequences for different groups. They all have different consequences if the public policy goes this way or if the public policy goes that way. And they all have a say in it, and they all want to try to push for their own side. And so that's why it's a conflict in demands. Everyone has their own demands that they input into the government, but the outputs may be way different than the actual demands that were input. And so that ultimately decides public policy. Even policies designed to protect the common good may have certain consequences because certain groups always lose out in politics. And that's all under the realm of public policy. The two basic categories of public policy, once again, are domestic policy and foreign policy. You should be able to very easily distinguish between the two. Domestic policy, anything that happens within the United States. This can be anything, but ultimately the growth of social welfare and over economics and things like that, that has made it the largest area of debate. Foreign policy is anything that pertains to how the United States deals with other countries. So foreign policy and defense are usually among the oldest of our policy debates, because the fact is, since the beginning of our nation, and even before then, even before we actually established the United States of America, we were dealing with foreign policy. We were dealing with a foreign adversary in Great Britain. We also dealt with the French during the French and Indian Wars. So that's why foreign policy and defense are among the oldest policy debates. But foreign policy is just when the United States is dealing with any other country, and that's ultimately falls into the realm of foreign policy. So, all right. Now sticking just to domestic policy. With domestic policy, I said there was a number of things we could have talked about, because anything that happens within the United States or affects only the United States is considered domestic policy. But the thing that I really wanted to talk about most with you, because I believe that's the most important, because you are part of this economy overall, is economic policy. And so that's why we talked about that under the domestic policy realm. So, with economic policy, there is three main categories. There's trade policy, monetary policy, and fiscal policy. Trade policy is just how the government regulates the economy by raising or lowering tariffs and encouraging or discouraging trade with other nations. Monetary policy is where the government regulates the economy by manipulating interest rates. And then finally, fiscal policy is where the government regulates the economy through its powers to tax and spend. With trade policy, we talked about the balance of trade. Balance of trade, it measures the difference between monetary value of imports and exports. We talked about a trade surplus, which is where you're exporting more than you're importing, so you have a pretty independent economy, it's running really efficiently, you're producing things, versus a trade deficit, which is when you're importing more than you're exporting, and so your economy may not be running as efficiently, you're importing so many goods, and you're not really producing much for yourself. We also talked about the trade debate under trade policy. We talked about protectionism versus free trade. We weighed the pros and the cons, and you did that in your discussion board as well, and you guys did very, very well. Protectionism is where you protect domestic producers and workers from foreign competition. You raise your tariffs, basically. You want to raise the cost of foreign goods compared to your domestic goods so that consumers are propelled to buy that domestic good over that foreign good. Now that helps your economy because your consumers are actually buying things, but it may hurt the economy overall because your consumers aren't getting enough cheap goods either. And that's where free trade really comes in. Free trade basically says that trade barriers should be dismantled. The flow of goods, capital, and labor should be unrestricted as possible so that you can pass those cost-saving benefits on to your consumers while you can take advantage of your comparative advantage and produce things that you are the best at producing instead of wasting your time on producing things that just can't compete with foreign goods. Now, there's foreign trade that is good, there's free trade that is good, there's free trade that is bad. That's why it's called the trade debate. You need to try to balance those out and try to take both perspectives into account. But for the purpose of your test, I can guarantee that there will be the definition of protectionism and the definition of free trade. So be aware of those when that question may come on the test. All right, so that was trade policy real quick. With monetary policy, we talked about the Federal Reserve, and we talked about interest rates and how that affects the economy overall. Monetary policy, once again, is the actions that the Federal Reserve undertakes to influence the amount of money in the U.S. economy. Monetary policy ultimately deals with inflation. Inflation measures the rate at which the prices increase. We talked about that as well, how soda used to cost 5 cents way back in the day, but now it's $1.50 if you go to a vending machine. That all has to deal with inflation and ultimately deals with the Consumer Price Index, which is just the market basket of goods. Consumer Price Index measures how much a market basket of goods costed way back then compared to how much that market basket of goods costs now, and you can see the price increase, and ultimately affects how much the consumers can buy, because if inflation goes up too much and the market basket of goods costs too much, people aren't going to be able to afford those sorts of things. Now, it all happens, and inflation is all controlled ultimately by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, I care that you know, is the central bank that oversees our monetary policy. It's the banker's bank, it's the government bank, and it's also the nation's money manager. Now, while it's called the Federal Reserve, it's not actually part of the federal government. It's as Federal Express, is what the saying that I put in our original lecture was. The Federal Reserve is not actually a part of the federal government. It has very little oversight. It's just a bank that ultimately manipulates our monetary policy. It ultimately monitors the amount of money that goes into the U.S. economy. And so that's why there's the question, audit the Fed. Should we audit the Fed? Should we give it a little bit more oversight so that the Fed maybe doesn't screw over our entire economy, more or less? That's a valid question. It's a very valid debate, and I'll let you guys go into it a little bit more if you want to. But just know for the purpose of your test, the Federal Reserve is just the central bank that oversees our monetary policy overall. Now, with monetary policy comes fractional reserve banking. Banks make money by loaning money. That's the way banks operate. But banks must have that money to loan it. And that's why you always have to have this reserve ratio, the cash in the vault, if you will. If a bank approaches the reserve ratio, there are two ways it can increase its reserve. You always want to have cash in the vault. That way you don't have a run on the bank and people are left without any money. So in order to have cash in the vault, you must have that cash in the vault. In order to have cash in the vault, you must have your reserves. And there's two ways to increase that. You can borrow from other banks at the market rate. That's just the rate at which the money is set based on the market value. Now, if there's not a lot of money in the market to borrow from, banks can turn to the Federal Reserve. They can borrow from the Federal Reserve at a discount rate. And this rate controls how much money is in the economy. You don't want too much because this would cause inflation, but you don't want too little because you want to have people have confidence in the market itself and in their bank and prevent a run on the banks. So the Federal Reserve is all about this balancing act between having too much money in the system and having too little money in the system. And the Federal Reserve tries to balance that sort of thing by using this discount rate and loaning banks money so that they have money in their vault. And that's basically how the Federal Reserve works. I know I probably didn't explain that too well. I felt like I was kind of rambling there. So if you need your questions, answers, anything like that, please send those my way. And I can also try to point you to a number of other YouTube links that may be more efficient at explaining reserve ratios and things like that. But you guys should be good to go. All right. And then finally, with monetary policy, we talked about GDP. I care that you know GDP. I can guarantee it'll be on your test. GDP measures the value of all goods and services produced in a nation. Now, we question GDP really quick because the fact is that because it measures the value of all goods and services produced in a nation, the fact is that we could produce a lot of things and count it towards our GDP, but it doesn't actually have really any impacts on actual economics. So if we borrow money and spend it on programs, we count that towards our GDP. If we build a missile and then shoot it and it just blows up, we count that too towards our GDP. So there is this kind of cautious about using GDP as an actual economic factor because we could just be inflating our GDP if we really wanted to. So, but know the definition of GDP for your test, and at least kind of be aware when you hear maybe on the news about GDP. Be kind of cautious about it because it may not reflect actual true economic production. All right, and then finally with domestic policy, we talked about fiscal policy, taxes and spending. I care that you know the difference between the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office. The OMB works on the annual budget, it constructs the annual budget, and it works with the president very closely. The CBO, on the other hand, the Congressional Budget Office, works with Congress, and it researches the effects of certain budget proposals and the impact that it will have on the economy. So the CBO is much more of a research type of institute. We talked about the national debt. We talked about a budget deficit versus a budget surplus. Budget deficit just means that you're spending more than you're raising money, and then budget surplus means that you're actually raising money more than you are spending. Revenue outstrips expenditures, and this is very, very rare. Revenue is how the government raises money, and it's usually through taxes. We talked about all sorts of different taxes. We talked about income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes, customs and duties, and other miscellaneous taxes. So be sure to be aware of those certain types of taxes and different types of tax policies. Expenditures are programs the government spends its tax dollars on, and these are things like defense, Social Security, healthcare, and the national debt. We spend money on a lot of different things, and often we spend more than we raise, and that's why our expenditures are more than our revenues and why we run a huge national deficit each year. Now, the types of taxes that I want you guys to be aware of are the progressive taxes, the regressive taxes, as well as the flat tax, corporate taxes, and things like that. Progressive tax, once again, just means that higher income individuals pay a larger percentage of their income. And this is the example that I gave you, which was income taxes. Those are a type of progressive taxes. There's 6 different tax brackets here in the United States. The more you make, the more you pay. The more you move up in the tax bracket, the more percentage you pay of your income overall. flip that, and we get into regressive taxes. Regressive taxes say the less you make, the more you pay, and the more you make, the less you pay. Higher income individuals actually pay a lower percentage of their income with a regressive tax policy. And the example that I gave you here was payroll taxes. Remember, as soon as you reach $110,000 in payroll taxes, you don't have to pay any more payroll taxes. So the incentive is to get above $110,000 so that you don't have to pay taxes anymore. You don't have to pay any more payroll taxes. That's the example of a regressive tax policy. People that make less have to pay more in payroll taxes, although they're paying less in income taxes. And then flat tax would just be that everyone pays the same percentage regardless of their particular income. And the example I gave here was sales tax. When you go to a grocery store and you buy a certain good, or you go to a store and you buy a certain good, they're going to charge you a sales tax. But they don't ask you how much money you make beforehand. They don't care about your income. They're going to charge you the same sales tax rate as everyone else that goes to that same store. And then finally, add on to the tax policy, we add corporate taxes. We talked about taxes that corporations pay on their profits. However, we also talked about a number of loopholes and double taxes where they can get away with not paying a whole lot of corporate tax, even though the corporate tax rate here in the United States is fairly high. Excise taxes are just taxes on what are called vices, basically, things that kind of, are socially delinquent in a way. These are things like alcohol, tobacco, and things like that. And then capital gains, customs, duties, and inheritance taxes. I'm not really going to put those on your test, but those are certain types of taxes that we did talk about in the original lecture. All right. Also with tax policy, fiscal policy, we talked about wealth inequality. We talked about the gap. I showed you guys that video real quick. And so just know that wealth inequality is basically just the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest Americans. And the wealth inequality has really grown in the past 40 years. We also talked about the Laffer curve, where you need to find an equilibrium point to raise the maximum amount of revenue, but also keep your tax rate within reason. And finding the Laffer curve is all about finding this equilibrium point. This is a point which you raise the optimum amount of revenue without putting a strain on people in your society or another. If you have your tax rates at 100%, you've taxed them too much, they have no money to spend, you can't tax any further, the government holds all the money. If you tax them at 0, you have no revenue, and people are spending money, but you're not getting anything out of it, or the government isn't getting anything out of it. What you want to find is the equilibrium point where people pay enough to keep the government running, but also have enough money to have for themselves and spend in the economy overall, and that keeps your economy going, keeps the government running efficiently as well. And that's what this equilibrium point is. And that's the basic idea of the Laffer curve. So, all right. And then finally, moving on from domestic policy, we talked about foreign policy within this final week here. Foreign policy, I mentioned a number of theories or approaches to foreign policy. We talked about isolationism versus internationalism. Isolationism, very simple. It's the belief that America should not involve itself in the quarrels of other countries and instead should pursue the policy of military non-intervention. So don't deal with any other nations. Let's handle our own business. Let's don't get involved in the quarrels of other countries. And this was really the approach of the United States for nearly a little short of 200 years, more or less, up until the 1940s. From 1812 to 1917, we had this era of isolationism. We fought the War of 1812. We dealt with Britain. We got them out of the Western Hemisphere. And then we started approaching our own nation, our own problems with the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine, once again, I care that you know for your test, was just the document that said anything that happens in the Western Hemisphere is our business. Let's not deal with anything in Europe or Asia or elsewhere. Let's just focus here locally. That's the Monroe Doctrine in a nutshell. It lasted from 1812 to 1917. Then we briefly got involved in World War I in Europe, and then we went back into isolationism from 1919 to 1940, and then we fought World War II, and ever since then we've embraced this idea of internationalism, the opposite of isolationism. Internationalism is a foreign policy perspective concluding that America's interest in peace abroad and liberty at home requires permanent involvement in world affairs. So we're all interested in peace abroad and liberty at home, and in order to do that we must be proactive. The best defense is a good offense. We must be very involved in world affairs to go on the offensive. And it's really been the approach of the U.S. since World War II. Since World War II and the Cold War era, we've had this idea of internationalism. America has been the leader in world politics in many ways and has always evolved in international affairs. Now, really this idea of internationalism first began with what was called the Truman Doctrine, which I can guarantee you will see on your test, as well as the Marshall Plan. And they're very similar because they came out of the same era, but they kind of talk about different things. The Truman Doctrine was much more of a policy geared towards communism, whereas the Marshall Plan was a plan much more geared towards economic assistance to Europe. But they both kind of dealt with American interest or American foreign policy interest around the same era. So the Truman Doctrine, once again, just was the doctrine signed by Harry Truman that said we would oppose the expansion of communism anywhere in the world. The Marshall Plan, after World War II, said that the Americans should be involved in the economic rehabilitation of Europe. So, both sort of things that got us more involved in world politics and really came out of the same era to try to address the spread of communism. Now, the spread of communism, or trying to stop the spread of communism, resulted ultimately in the Cold War, which we talked about briefly in the lecture. The Cold War, that I care that you know, was just the era of the USA versus the Soviet Union. It lasted from 1947 to 1918. There was ideological differences between the two. Here in the United States, we embraced the system of communism, or we embraced the system of capitalism. We embraced the system of capitalism, whereas the Soviet Union embraced the system of communism. And there was this whole battle, this ideological battle between capitalism and communism, and the USA versus the USSR were at the front of it. You ultimately had the Iron Curtain as well. Remember, I mentioned this in the original lecture. The Iron Curtain was this fictitious sort of thing, this fictitious barrier that they said draped over Europe, and it would separate the East versus the West, Western culture versus Eastern culture, capitalist culture versus communist culture. And this ultimately, the Iron Curtain, in many ways, the Iron Curtain was often placed around the middle of Germany. The Cold War also saw a number of crises and proxy wars in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. And then finally, this whole battle that lasted for 40 years didn't result in a shot fired between the two or anything like that. It just comes to an end in 1989 with the collapse of many of the Soviet Union governments, as well as the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that's kind of just was the end of the Cold War. The communist system wasn't thriving anymore. Their economy wasn't producing anymore. It couldn't keep up with the world competition. And the communist system just sort of collapsed, and that signaled the end of the Cold War. Capitalism survived, the USA survived, and the U.S. really became a hegemon after the end of the Cold War. Alright, so that's the Cold War really briefly. It's a very important era in our history. I know we feel sort of removed from it now. It's been a long, long time. But it's still very vital to U.S. foreign policy overall. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the different foreign policy types. We talked about a crisis policy, a strategic policy, and then the structural defense policy. The crisis policy, those sorts of foreign policy types occur when there is a threat to national interest, an immediate and impactful threat. The example that I gave was the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can also think of 9/11 or maybe Iraq's invasion into Kuwait. Those are all certain crises that have occurred in the realm of U.S. foreign policy. Crisis policy is often used with use of force implications because it's a very high salient issue, but also the principal actors are the president and the advisors. The visibility of the policymaking is very, very low, and the involvement of Congress or others from the outside is very, very informal. So it's a crisis policy. We need to handle it. We may use force, we most likely will use force in order to ensure an immediate response to the crises. Now, dial it down a notch, and then you have the strategic policy. And the strategic policy is much more forward-looking. It doesn't need to be dealt with immediately, and it's usually just designed to assert and implement the basic military and foreign policy stances of the United States towards others. And so the example I gave here is foreign aid. When you're trying to implement a strategic policy, you'll look into the future and say, well, this country will need this sort of amount of foreign aid, we need to divert foreign aid here, those sorts of things, to deal with our interests abroad. And it involves primarily the executive branch, since the executive branch is the one that handles foreign policy the most, but certain Congress members may be involved, particularly if they are on a certain committee that deals with foreign policy. And the formal decisions are usually made by the president, but Congress may get involved afterwards and try to overturn that particular decision. And then finally, the structural defense policy. That's just basically how do we spend our money on defense. Defense spending and policy programs Policy process usually centered in Congress since they're the one that deals with the budget, but the Pentagon and defense contracts and other interest groups are also involved as well to try to lobby for more money. So structural defense policy is just more dealing with the budget and trying to set up our overall system. All right. Then finally, with foreign policy, we talked about U.S. foreign policy now. Where is it at? I care that you're at least a little bit aware of foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy now, really, we have high level of defense spending. We spend more money than any other country or most other countries combined. We usually are around 47% or more of the global spending on military expenses. U.S. foreign policy involves a certain number of alliances. We have NATO, which is absolutely the most important, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is our most important alliance because it involves some of our most prestigious and oldest allies. We've also shifted over to Asia. U.S. foreign policy really focuses on Asia now. We have a number of Asian allies, including South Korea and Taiwan, as well as Japan. And our shift, or our focus into Asia, could be a response to the rise of China, although China is typically very friendly with the U.S. as well. I also talked briefly about foreign aid. Foreign aid is a huge part of U.S. foreign policy. Remember that Israel and Egypt receive around 75% of our total overall foreign aid. And I really do care that you know that Israel and Egypt are the two countries that receive the most foreign aid from us. We have troops stationed in nearly every region. The U.S. foreign policy is overreaching now. We've really embraced the idea of internationalism and being involved in almost nearly every region in the world. We've continued combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, and there's also a number of other countries which may seem to threaten U.S. foreign policy in which the U.S. is very involved. And then finally, foreign policy has really tried to focus on trade more recently. No longer are we fighting a lot of wars. No longer are there a lot of wars fought elsewhere in the world, to be honest with you. Countries fighting countries just doesn't happen that often anymore. What tends to happen more is that there's rebellions and things like that, civil wars rather than international wars. And so that's why foreign policy and trade is a huge part of U.S. foreign policy overall, because we need to focus on globalization and international trade. So that's kind of where U.S. foreign policy is now. If you guys would like to debate foreign policy or anything like that, I'm more than welcome to. You can send me a message. If you have any questions about foreign policy, send me those questions as well, and I can try to help you out there. But I do believe that's the last slide. Yes, it is. So you guys are good to go. Remember, test 3, it'll open on Monday, continue until Friday. You have the whole week to take it, so you guys should be good to go. If you have any questions, anything that I didn't review or anything that you're unsure of, that I didn't cover or need to clarify, send those my way. Other than that, good luck on your test 3. I'm sure you guys will do well. Congratulations on making it through this semester, and hopefully I'll see you guys around. Have a great summer.